who is an empirical study of key generation in cryptographic ransomware, presented by Pranshu Bajpai from Michigan State University. So all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This talk is about a specific part of key management in ransomware, the key generation part. So all cryptographic ransomware require unique keys in order to encrypt data on the host. And for that reason, they require key generation routines as part of their as part of their infection binaries. So in this particular talk, we're going to look at different key generation routines discovered in real world ransomware. To give you a quick intro, I'm Pranshu Bajpai. I've recently graduated with a PhD from Michigan State University. Currently, I'm employed as a security architect at Motorola Solutions. I co-wrote this paper with my advisor, Dr. Richard Enbody, who is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. So with that, let's move on to what we're trying to analyze in this paper. All cryptographic ransomware, so broadly, ransomware are bifurcated into two main classes. One are the cryptographic ransomware, which actually encrypt data on the host. And the other ones are lockerware. They will try to take the control of the device away from you, but will not necessarily encrypt anything. We are focusing on the cryptographic ransomware since they are the most severe form of threat. In the case of cryptographic ransomware, we have key generation routines that are a very integral part of their crypto systems. And not only do they need the key generation routines, they need to make sure that these are secure. Secure in the sense that the leverage that they have over the victim depends on the key, or a set of keys. If these keys are leaked or acquired via an alternative route, then they lose leverage over the victim. So for that reason, they need to make sure that the key generation happens securely. However, we've discovered in the past that many ransomware developers do not always get key generation right. So there's a variety of key generation routines that have been observed in the wild, and we'll be discussing and categorizing those in this talk. And the motivation behind this talk is to understand critical characteristics of key generation in novel ransomware. So when a new ransomware hits, analysts are looking to quickly discover if there's any potential backdoors using which they can provide the victims access to cryptographic keys such that paying the ransom is not necessary. However, it's not always easy because as you can imagine, we have to disassemble the ransomware depending on what kind of languages it was written. We have to study the binary, and we have to answer certain important questions. So in this talk, we're highlighting some of those questions as well. So for example, what kind of random number generator was used in the creation of the key? Ultimately, key material will be derived, the randomness will be derived from a pseudo-random number generator somewhere on the system. And so what kind of randomness was used? Basically because it affects security of the key derived. What kind of API was used for key generation? Where did the ransomware acquire the keys from? A lot of the times it will abuse the victim's crypto API and obtain the key from there. Then there are questions like, did the key generation happen on the host or was it remote? Similarly, did they use a standard crypto system or a standard algorithm for encryption, or did they use custom algorithms? Basically, the idea is that we want to zero in on any potential vulnerability in this procedure in order to acquire the key. And finally, there's questions such as single key versus multi-key encryption. Sometimes they use the same key to encrypt everything, whereas certain later variants use multi-key encryption, where a new key is generated to encrypt a new file, and then that key is discarded, and then they start all over again. So we'll be answering and looking at some of those questions in this talk. So primarily, very broadly speaking, we can divide the key generation strategies into asymmetric and symmetric, where we're talking about which key was employed in data encryption. I'm not talking about the key that was used to protect the key that was used for data encryption, but the key that was used for the data encryption itself. So data can be encrypted with an asymmetric key. However, that's really inefficient, but it can be done. And then it is mostly encrypted using a symmetric key. So an example of an asymmetric key would be an RSA key, and a symmetric key would be an AES key. So within those, they can use a static or dynamic generation. And that means that they can either hard code a static key, for example, within the binary and use that for all subsequent encryption. However, you can imagine that's not very secure, and that's not the right way to do it. However, we've seen a lot of ransomware do that in the past. So it can be done with a static key, or it can be done with a dynamic key, which is what the most virulent variants will do, is dynamically generate new keys. So where do they get these dynamically generated keys? They can get them from a number of sources, depending on how they've written their routines. They can use the standard crypto API that is available on the host already. In that case, they avoid bringing any additional APIs with them or contacting the CNC server or anything of that nature. And they can build it using ephemeral data, system time, for example. We've seen that they're deriving keys from things such as system time and other system name and other such strings. However, as you can imagine, that's very insecure. They can bring in their own libraries statically bound with the thread that makes the infection binary bulky, but it can be done. Then there are non-crypto random number generators where they get the randomness, and these are not cryptographically secure, so there's security impacts there. But we've noticed that that has also happened. Network key, they'll reach out. We don't see it a lot these days, but in the earlier variants, we did see them reaching out to a CNC server and obtaining the key generated on the CNC server and then using that to encrypt the files. Why that's not observed so much, we will be discussing in the later slides. So starting with the asymmetric key, so basically this is the difference between a static key and a dynamic key. So on the left hand side, you see in the diagram that in the attacker's domain, they generate an asymmetric key, a public-private key pair. And the public key pertaining to this key pair, they will embed in the ransomware's binary. This binary will then be propagated using various infection methods and channels to the victim's domain, and ultimately end up on the host, where it will start encrypting the file using directly the public key, the embedded public key. Now, there's several downsides to this. Number one is asymmetric key encryption. Bulk data encryption with asymmetric key tends to be really slow. It also can inflate the size. So there's ciphertext expansion. So those are already inefficient in terms of infection. In addition, once the ransom has been paid, and if the ransomware wants to show good faith so that other victims also pay and wants to actually decrypt the files, he or she would have to surrender the private key to the victim in order to decrypt. And because this private key can now also decrypt other victims, this is an inefficient system, both cryptographically and operationally. We did see some variants using that. Now they've moved on, though, for the most part. In the other diagram on the right-hand side, you see that the ransomware developers are actually using, again, they're generating a public-private key pair on the server side, in their domain, and then propagating this infection binary to the host, where the infection binary will actually generate, using the victim's computer, using the victim's crypto API, a new key pair. And the good part about, by the way, that should be dynamically generated asymmetric key. So sorry about that. But they're still using an asymmetric key for encryption. It's just that in this case, it's dynamically generated. So with that, we mean there's a second layer of asymmetric key observed in the victim's domain. And in this case, when the ransom, again, it's inefficient and it's slow to encrypt, and there's ciphertext expansion. However, if the victim pays the ransom, they can actually ask for the encrypted private key that you see on the right-hand side, and decrypt it in their domain and send the decrypted private key back to the host that can then be used for data decryption. So the advantage here is that they don't need to share their master private key with anybody, and as such, other victims of the same campaign will still need to contact the ransomware developer in order to decrypt. So now we move on to what is more popular, is the use of symmetric key in bulk data encryption. As you can imagine, symmetric key encryption is much faster and is the preferred way of encrypting bulk data. And so most ransomware developers deploy this method. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is an auto-IT language-based ransomware, and this is a decompilation of that ransomware's source, of the ransomware's binary. So that gives us a peek into its source. And we are zeroing in on the routines that are responsible for the file encryption. So this down here, what you see in bold on the left-hand side is the crypt encrypt file call. And it's providing the parameters, including, if you notice, the algorithm ID, which in this case is the DES. And right before that, it's also supplying the key. However, the key is present, is statically embedded in the binary, and it's just 888. So this process is easily reversible. Believe it or not, this is not that uncommon to find in poorly made ransomware. So as you can imagine, it's very easy to decrypt files encrypted by such ransomware. Analysts discover such flaws, and then they build decryption software to provide help to the victims. On the right-hand side, we have a dynamically generated symmetric key in the case of NotPetya. And in case you cannot read the assembly, I'm going to go through it. In the first box, we see a call to CryptGen key, which is a standard crypto API call used for key generation. We see that the algorithm ID is 660E, which is hex 4. If I remember correctly, it's AES 128-bit key. And it could be AES 256, but they're generating an AES key, and they're setting some flags while generating the key. In the next box, they're actually we actually see a call to crypt string to binary, which is another crypto API call, which will use the embedded string, which is actually the public key of the attacker, and convert it to binary format so that it can be used in the subsequent parts. And the next box, we see crypt export key. So after the data encryption is complete, it will actually protect the generated symmetric key. So the data will be encrypted with the generated symmetric key in the first box. And then this key will be protected with the attacker's public key that they've just imported into context. and using a call to crypt export key, another standard crypto API call. And finally, now that they've secured the symmetric key using their public key, they will destroy the plain text version of the symmetric key from the system using a call to crypt destroy key, because this key is no longer needed. And so that's the latest hybrid encryption, as we call it. And that's the secure and the right way of doing things. However, they can make mistakes in implementation of this this sort of routine as well. So we've also seen examples of key generation using ephemeral data. That one was being dynamically generated using the crypto API. We're still dynamically generating the key. On the left-hand side, we see a ransomware called Kimselware. And this was written in PHP. The source code is easy to read because of that. And we see there's a function conveniently named generate key. And it actually generates an AES key. It actually generates a symmetric key for us to, for the ransomware to use in order to encrypt the data. However, you see that that most of the information that is used in the construction of the key is repeatable. So once you notice that your files have been encrypted by this ransomware, when the ransom node is shown to you, you can actually read this this generate key routine and observe that they used, so key 4 is the final key that they're returning from this function. And it's constructed using key 1, 2, and 3. It's and those parts are document root. So this was meant to infect servers. So that's just the server root, server name. You already know those parts of the information. Then there is the date. Depending on when the ransomware hit, you have a good idea of what the date is going to be, because most ransomware will immediately show the ransomware ransom note upon encryption. So it's either the same day or the day before. And so you know that part as well. And then they go through a series of unnecessary modifications, so encodings and compressions, which can all be repeated. And ultimately, you can obtain the key that can be used to decrypt your files. So an insecure method of dynamic key generation used by this ransomware. On the right-hand side, you see key derivation from a password string. This is taken from a .NET ransomware. Because it's .NET, it's easy to decompile and read the source code. And what we're seeing is that they're generating a random string. However, observe that the random string is being generated using a call to system random. Now that's not good, because system random is not cryptographically secure. So there are attacks possible against, practical attacks possible against system random, simply because it was not meant to generate cryptographic secrets. However, in this particular case, they're going to generate a random string using system random, and then use this string to generate the key. So again, a repeatable process, and we can obtain the key and facilitate data decryption for the victim in this case. So the bulk of our study in the paper revolves around studying different key generation strategies in ransomware and then grouping them into several groups. So if you see on the right-hand side, those are the groups that we've discovered. Static asymmetric key, dynamic asymmetric key. Now that I've talked about some of these strategies, it's easy to imagine what kind of key generation they're employing under these strategies. And the CS stands for, is it's cryptographically secure, and the OV stands for, is it operationally viable? So some methods, as you can imagine, can be cryptographically secure but not operationally viable. Yes, if you generate a static asymmetric key and you use that public key to encrypt the victim's data, that's cryptographically secure. Technically, that's, if it's an RSA 2048 key, there's no way to decrypt data without knowing its corresponding private key. But it's not operationally viable simply because it's not efficient. It will take a long time, and it will cause file inflation. So along those lines, we've rated different key generation routines observed in modern ransomware, as well as categorized these routines. So WannaCry, the most infamous ransomware, perhaps, uses the dynamic generation using the crypto API. So it's actually a little complex in its key management, in that there are two layers of asymmetric encryption and one symmetric key encryption, and for each file it uses a different symmetric key to encrypt. So to that end, WannaCry ransomware dynamically generates the keys, the symmetric keys that it uses to encrypt the files using the crypto API. It makes a call to cryptgen random that generates the random bytes that it needs. Then it uses those to formulate a key, and that's what it uses to encrypt. Then it also generates dynamically on the crypto API an RSA key pair. It uses the public key from this key pair to encrypt the set of keys that was used to encrypt files. And then it comes with an embedded public key that it uses to encrypt the private key pertaining to this key pair generated on the host. And so it's got multiple layers. It's a little more complicated, but ultimately the generation of the encryption keys is happening using the crypto API. If you see the year, it's a later variant compared to some of the other variants on here. For example, GP code is an older variant, and you'll see that it was just using a static asymmetric key. Operationally, very bad. Paradise ransomware, dynamically generated an asymmetric key, but again, not operationally viable since it's really slow to use asymmetric key encryption with for bulk data. And there are some other examples. Jigsaw, for example, the earlier variants, we saw they use a symmetric key encryption. However, it was statically embedded, so it was easy to recover. So that's not cryptographically secure. And so on. So the details we've discussed in the paper, and you get the idea. We're trying to categorize key generation routines and comment on if they're cryptographically secure, if they're operationally viable. We're trying to also map it to which ransomware use these sort of key generation routines, and which year were these ransomware observed in. So we have also recognized some key characteristics in novel ransomware that we need to understand right away when we see a novel threat. These are the questions we need to be thinking about. So is the encryption key network-based or host-based? Well, if it's host-based, if it's generated on the host, or if it's present on the host, then that's a different scenario than if it's acquired over the network, because so the network keys can be blocked at the firewall level, because network administrators might share a list of known CNC domains, so malicious domains, and block them. In that case, a ransomware would never acquire the key needed for encryption and will not work. So those kind of questions are important to answer. Was the encryption algorithm standard or custom? No matter how good somebody thinks their custom encryption algorithm is, it never withstands professional cryptanalysis. So it's important to know that. Key generation, static or dynamic, bulk encryption, was it done using a symmetric key or an asymmetric key? Key persistence, is it secure or vulnerable? Sometimes key needs to be kept in removed from memory. Symmetric key needs to be removed from memory as soon as possible. And to that end, it's important to wipe the keys as soon as they're no longer needed. And we've noticed, I believe it was Crypto Defense, which actually dropped its key very conveniently in the C drive after encryption. And so experts just acquired it from there and provided a decryption tool to the victims that was able to decrypt the files. Then the key material, where is it getting derived from? Is it from a cryptographically secure source, or is it vulnerable? For example, I showed the system random being used. then there's certain other questions we need to answer as well. For example, the encryption key, are they using the same key to encrypt everything? In that case, there's one key and it lingers in memory for a long time. Or are they using multiple keys? In this case, each key will be used to encrypt one file. Finally, to conclude, we've attempted to map out key generation strategies according to the year in which they were observed. However, as you can imagine, we need more data on here in order to build a realistic sense of trends. This is a start, but it's difficult to do on a mass scale because all of these ransomware are obfuscated in some manner and using some packers, for example, and we have to deobfuscate them and then study and then look at the assembly code depending on what kind of language it was written in. We don't have access to the source code, so we have to read the assembly code, then figure out these details about the key management and what encryption algorithms, etc., were used, and then we were able to actually answer these questions and put it and derive trends. So with collective community efforts, we can expand on this and hopefully build some trends that we can observe. In conclusion, we've seen that weak generation models continue to appear, and because these weak encryption key generation models appear, we actually see efforts like No More Ransom, where experts actually decrypt data for victims if the ransomware is found to be weak in its key generation. And ultimately, they are learning, and they will replace the weaker models with stronger models. However, until then, we still need to focus on how we can help the victims by recognizing signs of insecure key generation. And they will keep using high-level APIs, so that's an important part of the system we need to keep an eye on. And with that, I conclude this talk. Thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Pranshu. It's been great. I think that we have time for a quick question. Do you think that key generation routines could be used in order to identify when there is some ransom trying to encrypt your files?
Right. So that's a good question. However, that will generate a lot of false positives. Because the methodology that most effective variants today are using are standard methodologies. They're being used by a bunch of software on your system. So for example, if we're talking about WannaCry and it uses CryptGen random and CryptGen key, those are standard crypto API calls that will be used by a lot of applications on your computer. So that would be difficult to do because of the amount of false positives.